I was a young animator working at a company called Pierce Studios in Hanwell, West London, where I'd been a trainee animator working on things like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, BBC TV series, and there were pseudo computer graphics involved in that. All hand drawn, all the lettering was done with Letraset, rub down transfer letters. And some of those techniques we then used in later projects. I did a little bit on Blake 7. But the big one came along with Gerry Anderson, and he'd seen my work at Fanderson 81, a little short film as an intro there. Once he was actually up and running with his new series, he'd got the finance and LWT and whoever had come on board. He then remembered me from Fanderson 81 and my work and got in touch and came down to the studios. This was a big day. This was a big event. It was quite exciting, you know, childhood hero. Thinking of all those programs and films that he'd made over the years. And he came for a meeting, had a look at what the studio could offer. By this point, the studio had begun to do work with computers. Pierce Studios' computer was, by nowadays standards, extremely crude. It was really a workstation meant for doing architectural design, sort of more CAD based sort of stuff. It could do line drawings. There were no colour images. There was no way of going directly from the computer onto film, so this meant going through an artwork stage. And the way this worked was that the animation that had been done on the computer by people like Rod Lord and John Percy, who were the senior animators there. I was sort of fairly junior. I'd just gone freelance, but I was still working mainly there. The animation that they produced was plotted out on paper by an ink pen, and this plotter would take forever to draw a single image. For instance, the video game, which was the initial piece of work that I was commissioned to do by Gerry, the video game that Neinstein would play involved flying through a group of buildings with a rocket ship blasting away at flying saucers coming towards them. Now, the buildings had to move in 3D, so there was no way of really doing that convincingly by hand. The computer medium was obviously the way to go. So the plotter would print them all out individually like this, and then you'd get the effect, if I just flick through them, of the buildings coming towards you. Well, as plots like this on paper, as you can see, you know, they took a long time to draw each individual one, but they were dense in ink so that we could actually make a contact print with them and turn them into a black and white negative, so that all the black lines would be clear and all the white areas would be black. So here's what we produced from the computer artwork. This is a high contrast lith made in the darkroom as a contact print from those computer plots. And there was one of these for every position of the building. I think there was something like 96 altogether. And as you can see, it's the left-hand side of the street only, because you saw how long it took to print to just that side of the street, and it would have taken even longer for the rest of it. So we would just, under a rostrum camera, which is essentially a camera looking down at a backlit table, we would then photograph each drawing in turn. And to put some colour in, just have this. Blue gels, as you probably get in spotlights or something like that, behind it, and the camera would be looking down at this, and so we'd take one frame of that, remove it, and shoot the next frame, and shoot that, and so on until the buildings gradually creep towards you. So, having exposed the left-hand side of the street, well, the right-hand side is all black, so there's nothing exposed on the film. And with the shutter closed, the film's wound back to frame 0, and we start again with the same artwork, only this time we photograph it over on the right-hand side. It's simply flipped over. The beauty of the black backlit artwork is that you can then use the artwork in a number of different ways, and that will become clear when we talk about the end titles. Now, I'd originally been taken on to design the video game, Einstein's video game, but I'd seen a copy of the script for Expect the Unexpected Part 1, the pilot episode, and I saw that there were just some rough notes on the title page for the title sequence. It said things like Mars invaded, Earth attacked, Earth defended by Terrahawks. very simple outline, and I imagined it being very much like a lot of other Gerry Anderson series, lots of action and these graphics flash cut in between. And Gerry had kind of, I think, had briefly mentioned that we'd probably be doing this lettering as well. And I took a look at it and thought, well, maybe we can do something a bit more inventive. Now, I did a rough storyboard, which sadly seems to no longer exist. I don't know where that's gone. But this rough storyboard I took along to my first meeting at Bray Studios with Gerry, where we secured the deal for the video game. And he said about these titles, and I said, well, I've got something here. I don't know if it's quite your cup of tea. Showed him this storyboard, and he was delighted. Not particularly with the way that I'd done it, but because I'd kind of solved a problem that I didn't know he was having. All of Gerry's previous series have been made on 35mm, which is a much better picture quality, much more standard format of film to be to use. But for the first time, he was shooting on 16mm. Now, Gerry's of the old school, whereas 16mm in those days particularly was thought of as being like bootlaces. You know, the proper stuff was 35. If he was going to have to dupe action sequences from other episodes to make a montage for his titles, the 16mm dupe quality is a bit rough. It's very grainy, and he didn't want his title sequences to look grainy. So by presenting him with a storyboard of a continuing flow of graphics, we could actually shoot it on 35mm and make 16mm reduction copies for him to cut into his episodes, and thereby retain good quality opening titles. The opinions divided as to whether the action sequences are better, and you know, I quite enjoy those. I love Thunderbirds and things like that, but the graphic sequence was a way round the problem of the maintaining the quality of the image. I was then commissioned to do a full-blown storyboard for the title sequence, and went away to design that separately, and came back to Gerry with the finished thing. He approved it, and we went into full-blown production on the title sequence. The title sequence was made up using a mixture of different techniques. Some of the backlighting, as we just saw with the computer game, some top-lit images which were largely photographs, specially shot for the sequence. For instance, the video game surround. If you remember, the opening titles begin with a video clip, a video game clip, on a screen that purports to be in the cockpit of the Terrahawk. And so they photographed the screen itself, which was rather messy in the middle there, so we painted a black mat, and everything that we animated happened within that screen area to begin with. So we had the video game going, and then the shot of Neinstein, which interrupts. The original version of Neinstein to be put into that screen was him actually in the Terrahawk cockpit turning to camera, but he delivered it a little bit slowly, and I think that they decided that it would be better to shoot a faster version, and indeed they shot one, and it was delivered to us in time to add into the sequence. Now, we shot the sequence twice. The first time we back projected the image of Neinstein on the rostrum camera, and we discovered that his face had gone a little bit green, the colours weren't quite right. There were some other minor changes made to the sequence. Some of the photographs needed retouching really to bring out some of the darker areas. A lot of the shadows had gone very black. And a very important change that was added to it was that Christopher Burr asked for his name to be added to the opening sequence, so it became Gerry Anderson and Christopher Burr's Terrahawks. There was a special photographic session for the spaceships. They'd already photographed all the hero puppets in classic kind of heroic portrait mode, and Gerry actually had a series of those dotted around the walls of his office. Very striking set of portraits. We had a little bit of retouching. You see on this cell there's a little bit of retouching on Hero's hair, but we set up a special shoot for the model spacecraft to be photographed in the attitudes as I had drawn on the storyboard. And that was an interesting one. Gerry had put me in charge of this shoot on a Saturday. He brought his team in. I think there was Steve Begg, Harry Oakes, the cameraman, and I think another assistant, and the stills photographer Doug Luke, who had worked on various other Gerry Anderson productions. And because he couldn't halt the production during the week, they were running 5 days a week constantly, they set up this special still shoot on a Saturday. But I was a youngster then, first time I've been put in charge of something like this, and one of the problems was that he'd asked for the shoot to double up as heroic poses of the craft to be used for publicity purposes, as well as the angles and attitudes that I needed for the title sequence. And of course this meant that we had double purpose for the stills, and it slowed us up immeasurably, because for my purposes it didn't matter if the strings were showing that held the craft up when we photographed say the Terrahawk against a blue sky background. It didn't matter to me if the wires were showing, because I was going to paint black mats around them to cut them out and put them on the black background. But for the heroic publicity poses of the craft, they went through all the usual rigmarole that I understand they did for the model shooting, which was to use various coloured powders to puff out all the wires. Now this took forever, and increasingly as the day went on we found we were getting less and less time to do each one of the craft in turn. And indeed I think for the hawk wing we never really quite got the shot that I wanted. One of the interesting ones was that for the Zeroids, when we put those up for the shot that I needed, in order to get the nice low angle looking up at them, we put them all on rolls of gaffer tape, or duct tape as I think the Americans call it. But then for the publicity purposes we put some greenery in front, and you may have seen that photograph on one of the posters. But as far as I was concerned, once we'd actually got the shot that we needed, we could then paint a black mat to cut them out. And if you remember in the title sequence there was a nice red stripe went across here with the word Zeroids written on. Another interesting one was the logo, which the main Terrahawks logo had been designed by a guy who was working in the model effects department at Bray, and that was Mark Harris. And Mark had done a very nice airbrushed logo, of which this is a print. But this was famously a story that went round everybody at Bray, and it was hilarious. Much hilarity was had by all when we discovered that Mark was actually a member of the Anderson Burr team, and as such, because he designed the artwork, they had to legally buy the logo off him. And so Gerry bought it for the legal minimum, which is £1, and Mark Harris decided that the £1 was much better off framed and put in the bar at Bray, just to remind people kind of the remuneration that you would get working for Gerry Anderson. To aid with the title sequence, we were given various bits of reference. We had the hero shots of the puppets, which were, you know, nicely posed portraits. We had the specially shot photographs of the models. Plus we had things like this reference artwork of the original blueprints for the Zeroids and the cubes. Now that was quite important because the Zeroid was actually put onto the computer and was modelled so that we could get a nice animation of it bouncing and rolling away. And this is one of the original computer plots that was used. Not all of the Terrahawks title sequence was computer animated. For instance, the heroic shot of the Terrahawk here, which in its dynamic pose, a bit like a sort of pterodactyl or something. Originally I was going to have it fly up into camera, which is why it's mounted on this card like this. We were going to start up here and track it down like that. But in the end we decided, no, what would be more fun would be to morph it, although the word morph in the computer context hadn't been invented yet, to change it from the silhouette of the ship here into the silhouette of the logo. When we worked out how long the computer would take to do it, we realised it was much quicker if I did it by hand. So that was actually one short little bit of traditional hand animation. I think we tested it once and did it on single frames and realised it looked a bit quick, so for the final version of the titles we slowed it down. I've taken the artwork along to a few conventions and things like that, and I think people are always surprised to see how tatty it all is. I must emphasise that these techniques really aren't used very much anymore. Nowadays everything is on computer, you know, everything's much slicker and tidier. For instance, here's Kate Kestrel and Hawkeye, just stuck down with little bits of sticky tape, which is all rotting now. I mean, it is 20 years ago. Things like sometimes we found that the edges and the highlights of the characters need a little bit of help and a bit of retouching. And a lady called Betty Day, who was one of the animators at Pierce Studios, she did a little bit of retouching on a cell overlay, an acetate overlay, a little bit of retouching on Hawkeye's hair there. And Neinstein was pretty much the same. Again, all just slapped down on the on pieces of cell. And again, there's a little bit of retouching on his hair, and on some of the craft as well. I mean, you know, for instance, the Battlehawk itself is well, it's pretty damn near a painting. It's been so heavily retouched. The original photograph underneath had gone very dark and very black in places, so there's an amazing amount of retouching on that until Betty had almost completely repainted the craft. Here's an obscure one. You probably don't even notice this. As Neinstein interrupts the video game at the beginning of the title sequence, it needed a little bit of video flicker. And of course we were making everything on film with artwork and photograph and pasted up bits and pieces. So here we have a bit of video shash. It was actually some printed up lines from a sheet of Letraset tone, or Letratone I think it was called, and just with a felt tip went through and blotted it out. And there's like 5 frames of this stuff, which we call video shash, and it just rolls down. Now each one of those must have taken about an hour. For 5 frames, I tell you what, we use those cells over and over again on countless jobs after Terrahawks. Just the same old bit of video shash, just done with black felt tip. It's difficult to remember that back 20 odd years ago, back in the days before people had computers at home, in fact very few people had VHS at home in those days, you know, to do anything that involved lettering for television, they didn't really have many caption generators. The BBC had started to mess around with it. They had some crude blocky sort of titling devices, and things improved over the years. But at that time we were still using the old graphic designer standby Letraset. Rub down transfers, the kind of thing that you would probably use as a kid, rubbing down little transfers of, I remember doing stuff with little cowboys and whatnot. But the lettering came in sheets like this, and we got through bags of it, as you can see. Loads and loads of lettering, because things like the M's would run out inexplicably. I don't know why the letter M was so popular. They put extra E's on because that's supposedly the most used letter in the English language. But M's, I seem to remember, always ran out. And the lettering style that we chose, there for Hudson colour, well, I chose it because it was called Spectrum, and I quite like the in-joke, but also because the R almost matched the R on the Rolls-Royce logo. So at the end of the programme, when it said filmed in Hudson colour, and I wanted the double R to look like just a quick hint of the Rolls-Royce logo, because Hudson was the roller, of course. So we chose this typeface called Spectrum, which of course was the organisation in Captain Scarlet. Bit hard to come by nowadays, but then we used it for absolutely everything. So the game over and the scores on the video game, the opening titles, the end titles, everybody's lettering in Terrahawks was done with the same Spectrum typeface. The only thing that was different was for the end titles, the Anderson Burr Pictures logo was simply blown up here from one of their letterheads and was animated on the computer to swing round. And if you remember that little bit of music that went with it, which we affectionately referred to as the cat whittling. My initial brief for Terrahawks as a graphics designer was to come up with a computer game. And I actually sketched these little things on the tube. They're just little doodles, they're not a proper presentation storyboard or anything. Just trying to work out what would be good, how the spaceship might drop its bombs or fire things, and don't know what that is. That's not a Terrahawk. And after all these little doodles had been thought about and discussed for a while, then I'd actually then do a proper presentation storyboard. So we got a recording of the music and played it back frame by frame and broke down all the beats of the music so that everything could happen in time to the music. Lettering would flash, which was simply a way of double exposing a very bright overexposed set of lettering over the top of the original lettering. Images would flash as they appeared, or indeed for Zelda the images would work in time to the music. So we'd have a series of black mats that would reveal one image at a time. Her brain would scan in, followed by her eyes and mechanics as if she's some kind of cyborg, and then there was another layer for her skull, which was actually based on an Aztec mask that I remember seeing at the British Museum. And gradually, one by one, these would scan until you build up the entire image. So once we had Richard Harvey's music broken down on magnetic tape, we could actually then work out where all the different frames were. If there was a beat of music where we could flash in some lettering or flash an image as it appeared. We'd just briefly overexpose the image just for a few frames and fade it down to normal exposure. That's how that was done. Animations would be plotted very carefully on the dope sheet. For instance, every line here represents one frame of film, and each column was another exposure on the film. Every layer of the artwork building up layer after layer until the full image is complete. So for instance here we've got the grid appearing, things are happening on the beat of the music. You've got Mars invaded suddenly being picked out there. We know exactly which frames they're going to go on, and the whole thing is planned out on this sheet so that by the time you get into the rostrum camera room you know exactly where everything should be. At any given frame of film you know where every piece should go. And that was it. Sometimes we'd have as many as 20 or even 30 exposures on the same piece of film. And, you know, multiple exposures builds up a richness of the image, and everything works in time to the music. Another piece of the Terrahawks title sequence that was done on the computer, again plotted in ink on paper in the old-fashioned way, was the Terrahawk shield, which was designed by Mark Harris. And we were given an airbrushed, I think, piece of artwork of it. That was then scanned into the computer. So here's the computer plots of the shield, which then bit by bit tilt up towards camera in 3 dimensions, and we zoom through the middle. When it came to the end titles, I thought the Zeroids and the cubes were definitely some of the most interesting elements of the programme, and perhaps we could play a game with them during the end titles. And I thought perhaps Zeroids versus cubes, say chess, but Gerry Anderson thought that maybe that some people don't quite get chess moves, they don't play chess, they might not understand it. How about simplifying it? And for a while I thought about drafts. We could move them around on a computer graphic drafts board. But Gerry then said, well, it's even simpler, what about noughts and crosses? And since some of the cubes have crosses on one surface, and the Zeroids are essentially you know, noughts, so that seemed to work very well. They were manipulated on computer by Rod Lord, printed out, plotted out on paper again in ink by the computer, backlit under the rostrum with little pieces of coloured gel cut out to make the cubes red and the Zeroids blue. Very much the plot was that the Zeroids, being the heroes, should win fair and square, and the cubes, being Zelda's baddies, that they should only win by cheating. And we actually came up with 3 different game scenarios where the Zeroids win and 3 scenarios where the cubes win. And we found that because the artwork was backlit, each of those 6 different games could be flopped over. So we ended up with 12 different games, the 13th one being the opening, being the end title sequence for the pilot episode, which the matting process on that was a little bit more complicated, so we simplified it over subsequent episodes. So essentially you can find about 13 different noughts and crosses games if you watch across the whole series. Each title sequence was shot individually for any given episode because members of the team came and went, so the lettering at the top of the screen had to change as production team members changed. And you know, it was pretty much random really. Some weeks the Zeroids would win and some weeks the cubes would win. And even now I find that people of a certain age, they would have been kids when the show was originally on, seem to remember the Zeroids and cubes, the noughts and crosses game every week as being an essential part of the entertainment, trying to guess who was going to win this week. As each of the Zeroids and cubes appeared, what we would do is simply on the frame where it appeared, cover up all the other Zeroids and cubes, remove the coloured gel and just flash for 12 frames. It would be overexposed, very bright, with a bit of smeary Vaseline on a cell just near the lens to just overexpose that one character briefly for half a second, and then the shutter would be gradually closed down until it faded out, and then we'd wind the film back those 12 frames and put in the coloured gel. So you just have, just for half a second, one of the characters would flash and appear, and throughout the sequence you see that happens, and it usually happens on the beat of the music if we've done it right. And then the lettering would be double exposed at the top of screen as with yellow gel behind it. Apart from the title sequence, the computer game and the end titles of the noughts and crosses, there were various other little jobs that came up during the time. There were special end titles for each of the VHS home video releases in the late 80s, or mid to late 80s. There was also Kate Kestrel released a couple of singles, and one of them was SOS Mr. Tracy, and again they wanted some graphic SOSs to cut in amongst the pop video. So I just did a storyboard with a number of different ways of revealing SOS, Morse codes, dots and dashes, that kind of thing, and you know, little pictures of Kate Kestrel flashing up in between lightning bolt ones. Anyway, I shot a variety of them, and a couple of them I think made it into the video. I gave them a choice. Then it came to the sort of round about late '84, I think it was. I was asked to do a special end title sequence for the American version of Terrahawks. I understand there was a whole animated extravaganza for the Japanese titles of Terrahawks, but they wanted to use a Kate Kestrel single for the end titles in America, and Gerry was quite concerned that we just do some kind of a cheap sequence. He didn't want to use the noughts and crosses because there weren't going to be a variety of sequences, so we wouldn't get the idea of the noughts and crosses, you know, different ones winning each week. So he wanted something simple, something where we could combine all the different captions from across the whole series where different members of the production team came and went. And the simplest thing was to just do a little bouncing Zeroid, which is what it was. There was a piece of graduated tonal background which was bought from an art shop, and a little cell of a bouncing Zeroid that was literally panned up and down, bouncing at the side of screen, until eventually bounced and crashed down on top of one of Zelda's cubes, and ultimately smashing it all to pieces. That was a nice little sequence. A lot of the artwork has disappeared now, sadly. Some of the stuff I've managed to keep. You know, Terrahawks is quite important to me. It was my first job as a freelance animator, so I look back on it now quite fondly. And you know, I had nieces who were, you know, very young at the time and enjoyed the series, so I kind of enjoyed it through them as a viewer. It's nice to see that it's getting another airing now. Finally we get to see it in all its glory on DVD. Yeah, so the other string to my bow was doing personal appearances as Youngstar for Terrahawks, which we went to all sorts of places. Short version with Thorpe Park, we did RAF Upper Hayford. I did 3 days in Scotland wearing this very sweaty rubber mask that Susan Moore, who sculpted the original Youngstar and Zelda, had made, and she often appeared as Zelda, and Stephen Mansfield appeared as Sister, wearing one of Sue's old bra stuffed with socks, I seem to remember. But I loved doing Youngstar. You could get away with murder with the kiddies and that, and at Thorpe Park we had a blast. But he was my favourite. Oh yes, oh hello mother. Oh. Bit of a, I think they say all animators are frustrated actors at heart. But the weirdest one was having to be interviewed as Zelda in air at a toy fair on radio. And I hadn't even got the costume on yet, so I had to duck down under this sort of plinth and talk in the microphone and do my very bad, all apologies to Denise Bry, Zelda impression. They're cursed Terrahawks! Yes. Embarrassing.